Good morning. My name is Patrick Sullivan. This morning we're going to be discussing distributed denial of service attacks. So quick show of hands, is everybody familiar at least at a high level with distributed denial of service attacks? Okay, good. A lot of hands there. Thanks for that. So really in terms of agenda, we want to go through a brief introduction and we'll talk a little bit about, for a minute or two, how it is that we collect some of the data that we'll show, just to give you sort of a sense for the source data we'll be talking about. We'll get into some of the basics of DDoS, some of the fundamental techniques that we see there, move into some of the trends and statistics, data that we've captured, then get into more of the case studies with some of the adversary groups we see, and then briefly talk about defense. So to give you a sense for sort of the position we're coming from when we present on this, I feel that I have one of the more interesting jobs in the information security industry. With Akamai, we sit in front of a big chunk of the world's websites, and I've borrowed a slide here from our marketing department. But essentially, on the website, we're a reverse proxy sitting in front of, a big chunk of the world's top business web traffic. So we see, it's estimated 20 to 30% of the world's web traffic. So as we're carrying that traffic, when attacks unfold, we see those attacks. Additionally, we see via our BGP-based infrastructure DDoS protection, we see DDoS attacks targeting that segment of our customer base as well, which represents a big chunk of the gaming, financial services, government industry there as well. So we feel that we're coming from a pretty unique perspective when we talk about the visibility that we have into attacks. And my role at Akamai is, I work with our customers along with a team of enterprise architects to help them defend against not only DDoS, which we'll talk about today, but also attacks targeting their web application, more application layer fraud attacks as well. But this is the data, basically sensor network that we use, and then all of that data we pull down into a security big data platform, right? So as we're carrying all the websites that, for the top 100 commerce sites, 98% of those, where we see security events, we pull that down to a large big data security platform, right? And there as well, we're sitting in front of all branches of the U.S. military. We're supporting at the cabinet level 15 of the top 15 cabinet agencies. So when they're attacked, we see that, pull that down as well, and we're able to collect trends there, which we can share out to our customers and to others like we are today. So that data that we're collecting is roughly, on a 45-day cycle, about 2 petabytes of security data that we're parsing through to see some of the trends of what's happening there. So the focus today, while kind of in my day-to-day job, we protect against all of these type of attacks, not only the kind of the data theft, the defacement attacks, really today we're going to focus on DDoS, which, as a quick CISSP refresher is sort of the availability component of the DDoS triad, right? So, that we all know that there's a linkage there between availability, confidentiality, integrity. So we'll talk about, some of the trends we're seeing where a DDoS attack may be used to try to loosen some of the security controls around configuration, confidentiality, integrity, and then also some of the other motives there. But I would say on the local government side, it's been a very busy year for us. It's been a very busy year for state and local governments as well. So as we see things like some of the unrest that's occurred in some of the cities around the U.S. following police activity. Whenever there's a physical protest these days, you can almost always count on there being an online protest. And in some cases, there'll be an online protest even where people can't get there physically, right? So if you live in a particular town, you can go march, you can hold up a sign in front of the police station. If you're hundreds of miles away, some people voice their freedom of speech by launching attacks on websites. So that's been, for municipalities, been a very common source of attacks. We'll also cover some of the case studies we've seen for schools. So we see these DDoS attacks in universities. We've got some case studies there. And then I'm unhappy to report that we're raising a generation of children who are very proficient in launching DDoS attacks. We're seeing, as we've gone back to school this year, we're getting calls from a lot of local school districts where children in high school are launching DDoS attacks against the school. So the good news there is they'll be coming out of school soon to put those skills to good use. So this, we're kind of washed out here in the visual. I'll take you through this. This is a screenshot from Planet Z, the zombie movie. And I think this is the way a lot of people think about DDoS, right? You sort of have a wall and you've got a bunch of zombies who are trying to climb that wall. So it kind of portrays sort of a single dimension to DDoS, which is scale, right? So if those zombies get over the wall, you're in trouble. If they're not able to jump on each other's back and get over that wall, you're okay. But I think we take a more nuanced view to DDoS. There are just a huge variety of techniques. You don't necessarily have to go over the wall. You can go under the wall, around the wall, through the wall. Just a lot of ways to go about that. So when we look at a complicated enterprise network, we look at this more almost like a Chuck Norris black belt there, right? So is that better? Thank you. Yeah, I'll sit here in this chair. It's like a director's chair. So this is more similar to I think what we see, which would be even for somebody who's a black belt, like you see here, somebody who runs a very tight network. A skilled adversary has a number of pain points that they can go after, right? There are a variety of techniques you can go after to find a weakness, even in a very skilled adversary. So we'll go through some of the attacks, and certainly we've seen skilled attackers take down even very well-resourced, well-financed, very large financial services firms. These attacks continue to evolve. It's a very dynamic and I think very fun part of security. So when we go through these, we'll talk sort of about two different categories of attacks. One being sort of network layer packet floods, where it's basically just send as much traffic as you can, overwhelm a router or a firewall or an internet pipe. The other category, people talk about application layer attack or layer 7 attacks. Here it's in some cases less about the volume of traffic that you send and more about finding a weak point. Typically something like a database or an application server is far more fragile than an upstream connection for a well-constructed data center. So we'll talk about both. So kind of to get into kind of the network layer attacks, I think a lot of the protocols have been around with this. This is our friend TCP that we've worked with for a few decades. And if everybody plays nice, it works really well, right? We've got our generic Google Images business internet user conducting a nice three-way handshake to a server, right? Everything works well there. Everybody behaves themselves, and it provides reliability and flow control over a big chunk of the applications on the web. Unfortunately, this is why we can't have nice things, right? So if you have Dr. Evil, who doesn't want to play by the rules of those well-formed protocol handshakes, he can manipulate that in a number of ways, right? There's countless ways you can go about this. One case would be you send a bunch of syncs and you ignore the SYNs, you ignore the SYNAC, creating a memory strain on that server on the other end, right? So then our nice Google Internet business user comes along to try to conduct a handshake, and there's no resource there to respond back to her, right? There are countless variations on how you go about this. Dr. Evil could just as easily have spoofed his IP, said he was a completely different IP, and then when that IP got a SYNAC, it wouldn't know what to do with it, wouldn't have sequence numbers, it would be incapable of completing that handshake as well. So these have been around for forever and ever. They still make up a big chunk of attack volume, as we'll show, but a very, very popular technique or category of techniques for network layer attacks. And then as this unfolds, certainly that's fun to play around and abuse the protocol, but even more fun is if you can get a third party involved in this, right? So we talk about the reflection and amplification attacks, and you hear a lot about those. Is everybody familiar with reflection amplification attacks? Okay, so what this allows Dr. Evil to do is really sort of two things. Number one, he can mask his identity, and then number two, he can generate increased load for his botnet that he controls. So what he does in this case is he first scans the internet for vulnerable reflection hosts, right? And there are, again, there are constantly people researching this, looking for new vulnerabilities that will allow them to reflect and amplify an attack against third parties. So in this case, we're showing charge-in or character generation. And since that's a UDP-based protocol, in this case, Dr. Evil will send, roughly a megabit of charge-in requests. And I don't know if you can make it out, but we've got a whole script here that shows just how simple that is. And the IP here is not what you want to use in practice, but it's a private IP corresponding to his true target. So that vulnerable server, in this case, will get those requests, and it responds back with a far larger payload than what it received, right? So in this case, you've got a gain of about 380, I think, or 360 in this case. So if you're our nice Google Internet user, you get a whole bunch of packets that look like what you see there in the lower right. That server is spitting out a tremendous amount of attack traffic. So really, in this case, there's sort of two victims, right? So the first victim is the reflector, who basically has done nothing more than have an insecure network. They're running protocols that aren't configured properly. They have devices that aren't configured properly. So now they're being pulled into this attack, right? And some of the really nasty attackers that I've seen, they'll attack a bank with one of the other techniques, and then they'll use their DNS to reflect attacks to other banks. So imagine you're the CISO, you're dealing with a DDoS attack, and you're also getting calls from other bank CISOs saying, why are you attacking me, right? Because when they're doing their forensics, they're seeing all of that attack traffic coming from your DNS server, right? So very, very popular category of attacks, and these have been on the increase for a number of years. Any questions at this point on reflection amplification attacks? Does this make sense to everybody? So we continue to see those. You know, I think late last year there was really the primary culprit here of the reflection amplification attacks were the NTP amplification attacks, right? So this is network time protocol, run broadly across a number of devices. This offered tremendous yield to the attacker, right? So here you're getting closer to 500x. So a relatively modest botnet can project tremendous capacity if you're getting a 500x gain with that reflection. This, in some ways, is sort of a good news story. These were causing such carnage that there was sort of an altruistic effort to go find people who had these vulnerable versions of NTP, call them up, reach out to them, basically get them to correct their insecure NTP instance, right? So that we have, as an industry, reduced the number of available NTP reflectors, which is good news. And when we get into statistics, we've actually seen that effort pay off in that the average amplitude of a DDoS attack, you know, for the last 2 quarters has been on the decline. And that's primarily because of the efforts to take away this amplification reflection technique. So this is an example, I think, when NTP was, and we still see NTP very, very regularly. But again, as that inventory of available reflectors has decreased, we see a little bit less of this. So this is out of Asia, and it was sort of in the gaming sector. So this is sort of the epicenter of big DDoS attacks. You know, these days, kind of the gaming sees the biggest attacks of any vertical in terms of the really nasty attacks. And Asia, it's sort of the wild, wild west. I know it's the East, but there are no rules there. I think you talk to people, and they say, we're starting a new business. We're going to need DDoS protection because it's expected if you come into a new industry, your competitors will just attack you. It's very, very active. But this is kind of what life is like if somebody doesn't like you, I think, over in Asia. So we're looking at amplitude there in terms of gigabits a second. And all of those are going to be blended attacks, right? So you'll see not only NTP reflection, but attackers will choose from a variety of attacks. So they'll do the first category of attack with a SYN flood. We'll see NTP amplification mixed in there, along with DNS, charge-in. You know, all the techniques will be there, which puts a lot of pressure on a mitigator that's not experienced, because you have to essentially understand, not only have the capacity to ingest that traffic and process it, but you have to have the experience to know what are the indicators of a SYN flood or an NTP flood, right? You have to be able to mitigate the bad traffic while not blocking your good traffic, which becomes increasingly difficult. So this is kind of a typical campaign. You know, we see attacks targeting their DNS, their web infrastructure, which is kind of a category of attack we'll talk about in a minute, but also very, very similar. So this is kind of the new flavor of the month. So as the industry has been taking away NTP reflection, SSDP has really gained in popularity, right? So there's good news and bad news on this. The amplification gain here is not nearly as large. It's a little bit more modest. The bad news is, rather than kind of corporate servers that are running corporate DNS or corporate NTP, this is primarily leveraging home networks. So I'm far more pessimistic that there's going to be an effort to reduce this, the availability of this source of amplification reflection attacks, right? There is an endless volume of home networks, home routers that are vulnerable to this. and I don't think we'll get that repaired. So I think this attack availability is with us to stay, I think. And if you look at it, I know the visuals are hard here, so I'll try to read through a couple of those. But there are some scanning tools that kind of detail how an attacker would find available reflection points. And there have been studies done on where those available reflection points are. The really bad news is that Korea is #1 in the upper left, and that's bad because Korea has incredibly robust home internet, right? They have several times the average connection speed of the US. So the punch you can get from a Korean home user is far worse on their home network than what you can get elsewhere. The US is #2, Canada, China, Argentina, Japan, and then it gets more fragmented. But definitely a technique that we see a lot of over time. And we'll get into the stats to show that. So again, as I alluded to, typically attackers don't just choose one of these vectors. It's very easy for them to mix and match a couple of those, but this is a table that we produced for US CERT, or we produced the source data at least, showing the amplification factor, as well as sort of an indicator of what the vulnerable command to that amplification would be. So as you can see here, the worst culprit is NCP at 556. Chargen, which we showed earlier, is just under 360. SSDP is a more modest 30.8, right? So you don't get that huge gain, but you've got a much larger inventory of available reflectors, so it's harder to get after all those sources. And so that's kind of what we see with the network-based attacks. Sort of the other flavor of attack is the layer 7 attack, and really that stresses a different point in the infrastructure because of what I call kind of the data center capacity pyramid, right? So typically, the further you move to the right, the more fragile, the less capacity that exists, right? So as you move towards your upstream, typically people have far more upstream capacity than they do capacity on the router. You get more constrained when you get to your first security device, which is often what fails. We don't show it here, but a lot of times we'll see web app firewalls be very, very fragile. That's kind of the first thing that fails, which kind of gets into that interplay of confidentiality and integrity versus availability. I do talk to people who say when we see a flash crowd or we get a DDoS, the first thing we do is switch off our WAF, which is disadvantageous, right? And maybe one of the motivations for an attacker to launch that WAF. But as you work your way all the way over to the right, typically the database is the most fragile part of that application, right? So savvy attackers will send attacks that seek to pierce through all the way through to your database, right? So that has some implications, right? So if you are going to generate a well-formed HTTP or HTTPS request, you have to complete that TCP handshake. So you have to have, kind of give up, disclose the IP that you're attacking from, right? So that is one, potential drawback to this attack and why it's less frequent than some of the others. However, we do see attackers that typically the life cycle would be they take over, they know about a vulnerability in a very popular CMS, they go to scan for a bunch of cloud-hosted instances of that CMS, and they take over those cloud hosting instances. So in that case, they're willing to sacrifice those IPs. And they'll do things like, make a whole bunch of well-formed HTTPS requests for a store locator, an ATM locator, login pages, anything that causes a database hit. It does not take a tremendous amount of traffic in most cases to basically bring down that data center. And the other advantage for the attacker there is that as they make those requests, that they're circumventing more and more protection mechanisms that are out there, right? So if you're attacking over HTTPS, any type of a network-based DDoS solution really has no opportunity to protect against that attack, right? The attack payload is really inside of an encrypted packet. If you can't see inside there, the network-based devices are really looking at TCP headers. They're pretty much helpless against those type of attacks, right? And we saw people that have leveraged these type of attacks against some of the ISP protections and network-based devices. They've had pretty good success rates at circumventing those. So this, I don't think with the optics here we'll be able to get through, so I'll kind of talk through this. So the other technique we see here is what's under the low and slow type of attack. So in this case, we're showing a tool called Slow Loris, which, like all of these attacks, they're fully automated. There's really no skill required at all on the part of the attacker. There are, DDoS as a service, portals you can go launch, all these attacks, scripts you can download. But in the case of Slow Loris, we've seen really that's been fairly popular as part of the attacker toolkit. And this is sort of, to use sort of a baseball analogy, if you're a batter and you've been getting 100-mile-an-hour fastballs, that's what you're looking for. Somebody throws you a changeup, you're not looking for that. It's very difficult to defend against that. But the way slow loris works is somebody will establish a connection to your server, and then as slow as the protocol will allow without timing out, slowly drip feed in header data, right? So that session is open. They're hanging on to sessions on that server, but they're never progressing that connection through to fruition, right? So they're just hanging on to that session, right? And it doesn't take a tremendous number of those to bring down a site. So I've been on the phone with major financials that everybody would know the name, if we were to mention it, and they're getting attacked, and they call us in, and we're in there helping them try to triage that. And they're saying, we don't see any increase in traffic on our internet pipe, our network firewall looks clean. We're not getting attacked, but our servers just keep falling over, right? So then you have to kind of dig in a little bit deeper and look at connection rates and people sitting on those sessions. But it's very easy for an attacker to blend in on this unless you have controls that are very subtle that can look for these type of things. Because typically people think of DDoS as fast. This is the exact opposite, right? What you're looking for here is somebody who's coming in very slow, right? And there are, again, much like the network case, there's a bunch of permutations to these attacks as well. So slow loris is primarily sending in the HTTP or HTTPS headers slowly. There are also tools like Rudy, which stands for Are You Dead Yet?, which will come in and basically send the post body in very slowly, right? So you establish a post, and then drip feed in that post data, right? Very slowly. Again, the goal is the same. You want to sit on those sessions, consume all the available sessions on that server so that when a valid user comes in, there's no session to allocate to them. And then even probably nastier than that even is a slow read. So you make the request at the normal capacity, but then you constrain your TCP so that the responses you send back are very slow. So based on the asymmetric nature of most HTTP, HTTPS, this can be even nastier and very difficult to spot, right? Because in a lot of ways, this looks like just somebody with a bad internet connection that's just kind of sitting on a download, right? But if you do this enough, fast enough, you can cause loading issues there. And so the trends we see from attackers are very similar to all of the mega trends that everybody in IT talks about, right? So Internet of Things, we have absolutely picked up refrigerators participating in DDoS attacks, which is scary for a couple of reasons, right? So we're launching internet-connected devices all over the place, and there's probably not a lot of security engineering rigor into the software that's going into those devices, right? So that's one concern. The other would be, the implications there for IPv6, right? So as we launch the Internet of Things, that's consuming IP addresses, and we're getting a massive allocation of IPs with IPv6, right? So, they said if you represent IPv4 as sort of a golf ball, by comparison, IPv6 would be the mass of the sun, right? So any type of defense that's based on spotting an IP and kind of playing whack-a-mole, I think that those defenses were sort of obsolete in IPv4, but even less of a chance to succeed with v6. So mobile is another trend that we see here, and I think the stats there are today. I last weekend picked up the new 6S. I think they say that the compute power now in a 6S is greater than the aggregate compute power that NASA had when they put a man on the moon. And I'm using mine to play Angry Birds and read email and listen to bad music. But there is tremendous compute power now in these mobile devices. There is more and more capacity available. And there what we see, you'll see Trojan apps that show up in app stores. People download those, and typically, attackers like to get the most bang for their buck, so that will be a banking Trojan that will go after your banking credentials, but at the same time, it will hook you into their botnet, so we absolutely see mobile devices participating in DDoS attacks. And really kind of the difficult part there is, if you think about some of the unsophisticated ways that people may go about defending against a DDoS attack, it would be to block IPs, right? So if you see a lot of traffic coming from an IP, block it, right? And that in some ways, you really have to kind of consider what a successful mitigation may be, because if you're just looking at your data center, your servers could be healthy, your pipe to the internet could be clean, and you could say I've successfully mitigated that DDoS attack. But if you block an IP based on a couple of people, in Northern California on the Verizon network launching attacks, that IP you blocked is a gateway for a huge chunk of Verizon users. Or maybe you block an IP in New York that's an AT&T gateway, right? That one IP that you blocked that you think was so successful from your data center out approach has caused your application to be unavailable to a big chunk of users, right? So that's just another trend that's kind of raising the bar on the sophistication of mitigation that you have to put in place, right? And then finally, no surprise at all, cloud. Cloud is a huge trend that we see adopted with attackers, right? Not only with DDoS, every type of attack we see. We look at a lot of application layer scanning, and it's coming from the cloud en masse. But we'll talk about some of the attacks that hit U.S. financials, because I think that's probably one of the more interesting DDoS case studies in history. But really the whole trend there was around attackers that knew how to find vulnerable CMSs running in cloud hosting. So I think it's really kind of piggybacking on the shadow IT trend, right? So these days a lot of corporations, rather than going to their IT team to securely deploy code, have a plan to patch and update, they just go to a cloud site, they run a CMS, and they run their credit card. And now marketing is basically your IT arm and your security engineering arm, right? So not surprisingly, we see, because we're scanning for application layer attacks as well, we see a lot of attacks targeting sort of those trends of shadow IT. And CMSs just have a just huge yield, right? Some of those have millions of sites. So attackers certainly spend their time there. But if you think about that from the attacker perspective, traditionally a lot of DDoS attacks were from laptops that had been owned in one way or another and shepherded into a botnet. If now your botnet command and control is controlling cloud hosting servers, each node in that attack network has a completely different profile for how much capacity, how much compute that it can hit you with, right? So again, it's challenging some of the traditional mitigation strategies that are available and kind of raising that bar for what you have to do to be able to defend against these attacks. And sort of this is kind of an interesting one, I think, sort of with the interplay between DDoS and some of the other confidentiality and integrity. So, one of the things we see on our platform outside of DDoS is just tremendous, we call them account checker, but just login brute forcing, right? So every time there's a data breach, the login credentials, not every organization does a great job of encrypting those and salting those, so those credentials leak. And human beings do a horrible job of changing their password. So we see people that have amassed databases of username, password, and they just try them all day long, right? And sort of the bad news, some of the stats we've seen is, some of those botnets we see with that behavior, it can be as high as 1 out of 12 successes, right? Which is really scary, right? And sort of the epicenter of those attacks, nobody gets hit harder there than the travel sites. Really anything that can be monetized outside of the financial network or the credit card network is a very popular target, right? Because if you're an attacker and you start to tangle with the credit card agencies, they've got very, very robust fraud. Same with the financials. If you get after somebody's frequent flyer miles or their hotel rewards or electronics rewards, you've got a far easier task trying to monetize that, right? Because there's not that robust fraud network sitting behind that. But what this story on the left is kind of talking about a vulnerability that United Airlines has to account logouts, right? So some of these people that are trying to do the account checker to brute force logins, if you get very, very tight on your control there for how you lock out accounts based on that activity, what they'll do is then hit you en masse and create a DDoS condition, right? So a big chunk of your users that are valid are now locked out, right? So even though they're not succeeding with their primary goal, they're making you change the control. So kind of to go back to our Chuck Norris defense, they want to punch you in the head, but sort of like a boxer, sometimes you have to hit somebody in the body a few times to get them to drop their hands to go for the headshot, and that's sort of what we see here, right? It's DDoS being used to change the defensive posture of an organization. So DNS, this is a public service announcement. We see this one all the time, right? So there are, particularly the Syrian Electronic Army, they love to go after DNS, right? And these can be social engineering type of attacks, but we've listed it here. It's on our blogs. We highly recommend that you lock both at the server and client level your DNS. We see these DNS commandeering attacks all the time, right? And not only is that a DDoS, if somebody takes down your DNS or points that somewhere else, certainly that can create an availability challenge, but they're also using these for propaganda, right? So there's a case there where one of the DoD sites was, DNS was commandeered, and they point, once you have DNS, you can point that traffic wherever you want. So they pointed that somewhere where they could send their propaganda message. We've seen that even a sophisticated organization like Google has been targeted in this. But really the favored targets, at least of the Syrian Electronic Army, have been the media organizations, primarily just because it's a propaganda attack and they want as much reach as possible. The media sites offer the most reach, so that's their preferred target. But for political reasons, anything they can get that is a government site, U.S. government, is very, very popular as well. And this one, I think since it is sort of a public sector, we're talking government, I thought this one was interesting. This is sort of one of the more interesting developments that we've seen over the last year. So I think everybody's familiar with sort of the Great Firewall of China, where if you're a user inside of China and you want to request content that's external to the country, the government exercises control over that and will reset connections for material that they deem offensive. So that's kind of been around. I think people are familiar with that. That's evolved over a number of years. The new evolution that's seen there is what's called the Great Canon. So architecturally, it sits in the exact same locations. It's a sort of a sister service to the Great Firewall. But what that tool is used to do is users external to China, they make requests into China for content. If the government chooses, they will inject a JavaScript to your browser and then cause that internet user to launch a DDoS attack against the target of their choosing, right? So where this can get interesting is, a lot of browsers, obviously you navigate to a primary site, but these days, there can be 30 connections that are pulled together by your browser to compose a page. You're making calls out to ad networks, tracking cookies, social widgets, all of those type of content. And ad networks are probably the most interesting piece where this could come into play. The allegation, at least, based on, and it was documented with academic research, which is where I pulled this, was that the Baidu network, which serves a ton of ads, was actually used as part of this attack. So very interesting escalation, on the nationalized front here in terms of DDoS at the nation-state level, right? So in this case, I think the target was a pro-democracy website that was leveraging a software repository, so the attack was launched against that software repository. So very, very interesting scenario we saw there. So again, I'm not sure if everybody's able to see well, so I'll kind of talk through this. So over time, the trend has increased in terms of peak attack per quarter tremendously, right? So if you go back to 2005, you're looking at just a few gigabits a second, and in the yellow, we're looking at millions of packets per second. So again, back to our Ninja, the bandwidth per second is one measure. Packets per second is stressing a different point in your architecture, right? That gets into your switching capacity at your router. So you have to look at both of those. But they've increased, and then sort of, we did see that peak start to come down, and it's been down for 2 quarters in a row. Really, that's based on the loss of available NCP reflectors. So we're still seeing, huge attacks, and we'll get into some of the trends. The attacks are lasting longer, but that peak is down a little bit. And this is another interesting view. So this is sort of a scatter plot on a log scale. Again, going back quarter after quarter for 2013. So a couple of trends that I think this illustrates nicely is, number one, just the density, right? Look at how much more frequent these attacks are than they were a couple years ago. And what we're also seeing is just, at the high end, there are more attacks that are, 100 gig plus. So it's still rare to see, 200, 300 gig attacks, but, attacks on this log scale that are 70, 80, those are very common. We see those on a very regular basis. And frankly, the attackers only a lot of times use what they need to use, right? So if they're getting the job done with 70, they don't want to waste resource and go higher than that unless they need to. So the overall volume of attacks that we've measured, is up 132% from last year, so more than double in terms of frequency. The peak bandwidth is down. We talked about application layer, or that layer 7. That's more than doubled, stressing a different point in that architecture. The average attack duration being up 20% is interesting, right? So I think that kind of speaks to more determination, willing to keep those attacks running longer. That's kind of where we're seeing the stress. I know this one you guys won't be able to read in this room. So this is kind of looking at sort of the trends with a breakdown of port and protocol. So the most popular two are SSDP, which we talked about, using the reflection from home networks, followed by an oldie but goodie, the SYN flood. Mega attacks, here a lot of gaming is sort of getting the worst of it these days. And this is another slice of data looking at millions of packets per second, right? So in this case, this attack isn't necessarily more bandwidth, when we looked at the previous slide, but the attacker centers smaller packets. So they're trying to attack the router, right? Can you handle 214 million packets per second? Most people cannot. Again, kind of as we alluded to, gaming for probably the last 4 or 5 quarters is getting it the worst. And that's probably a pretty good correlation to the high school kids we're seeing now launching DDoS attacks on the schools. The gaming networks just get a ton of traffic. SaaS gets it, financial services. Education we're seeing is actually down a little bit from last year. I think when we look at Q3, based on what we've been seeing with back to school, that will be back up again. Top source, China is number 1, US is number 2. Big chunk of that US is the cloud hosting servers that are located here, right? That's a major source for those attacks. So there are a variety of different motivations. Sometimes you never know why somebody launched the attack. Somebody just didn't like them. But there are sort of some categories we look at. Some people still do it for the amusement, profit motivation. Extortion is one, DDoS as a distraction, and then sort of nationalized attacks. Those are sort of the major categories we look at. So we still see, attacking sort of for the amusement. So these, typically when people fall into this bucket, they will engage with their attackers. They're very humorous on social media or on Pastebin, and they taunt their targets. So here, some of the folks that we've seen here are a group that really kind of rose to prominence in December of last year. The Lizard Squad, they brought down some of the very largest gaming networks, and they've actually, they're very vocal. You'll see them on YouTube and on social media. They've actually evolved and developed a business model where they will now sell DDoS as a service. So they did this for a while. Now they have websites you can go to, and basically just as a SaaS, talk about what type of attack you want, how much capacity, how long you want that attack to evolve. So that's now sort of a business model for them. This attacker, there was a group called Ugnazi, and it was later disclosed that it was a 15-year-old California high school student that was behind it. He brought down the CIA. Again, the attack that I referred to earlier, using Slow Loris to bring down a massive financial services company. He was identified in that attack as well. So very interesting. And then a large, Rutgers University in New Jersey this week has been in the news, right? I don't know if anybody's seen this story, but there is an attacker who's very vocally taunting the Rutgers IT department. So he's engaging with chats, very, very vocal. But really the bad news there for Rutgers is they, based on Freedom of Information Act, reporters have discovered that they've spent $3 million over the last year trying to stop this attacker. They raised tuition by 2.3% just based on the expenditure trying to stop this attacker. And just this week, he brought him back down again, mocked them, mocked their provider that they've chosen to go with. It's no fun to be an IT at Rutgers this week, I would say that. So they're getting it from all sides. But again, these type of attackers tend to engage. They're very, very vocal. A lot of them have a good sense of humor. I know we're not supposed to laugh at this stuff, but they can be pretty funny. The other one that we're seeing just a ton of is sort of a resurgence of the DDoS extortion attack. So there's a group that call themselves DDoS for Bitcoin, DD4BC, and they have been amazingly prolific over the last, really started last year. But as you can see, or as you may not be able to see in this room, these are the number of attacks we've seen from them per month. And just to give you a sense on scale, this is 20, this is 45. So in June, we saw 41 attacks by this adversary. And their MO, well, let me get into this piece first. So what's interesting about them is typically when we see these campaigns that persist this long, that are this active, they sort of pick a vertical and they go after, right? So we see this in commerce, we see it in financial services. What's notable about these attackers is that they don't appear to be limited by geo. So my buddies that are in Asia and EMEA, they're getting calls for the same thing. So this adversary is global, and they go after every vertical you can think of. Right? which is unusual because typically the same suspects will pay. E-commerce tends to be the most likely to pay, along with some of the gambling sites. We won't do business with them, and they have fewer options if they're outside the law. But these guys are going after people that normally don't pay. So banks typically don't pay extortion, right? Government typically is not going to pay extortion, but these attackers have been undeterred. They're just going after everybody. And the technique that they'll use is they'll send a small attack, and then they follow that up with an email, right? So initially they were, a lot of the extortion attackers that are unsophisticated will go to a website, and you see that sort of chat with, do you want to chat? And that's kind of how they choose to engage with the extortion attempt. That's typically an indicator that somebody's not all that sophisticated, because if you imagine somebody's in a call center somewhere, they're not prepared to process an extortion note. So it typically takes a while to get to the security team. These days they've evolved. They're pretty good. They go to LinkedIn, they find the security team. That's who gets the email. They make boastful claims about 400 gigabits a second. We don't see that much when we have protected them. Typically, they're easily deterred. When we turn on our service, they go away. They say that in their extortion note. They name us. They say, if you're using those guys, we're not going to attack you, which is sometimes awkward when I'm talking to customers who are getting attacked. They're like, are you doing this? I have no desire to go to jail. It's certainly not me. But what's interesting is they give you 24 hours to pay, right? You won't be able to read this, but the way this works is they said, we sent you a small test attack just so you can see that we mean business. You've got 24 hours to pay us, right? And they give a Bitcoin address as a means of payment. This is really painful for an enterprise that's not prepared for this, right? So if you think about that, the stress level is very, very high. They're calling on the phone with us. Again, I think in June, I think probably 4 nights a week I was on the phone until the middle of the night with somebody. But it's very, very stressful for organizations that aren't prepared for this. And we'll talk a little bit about defense, but that stress and that short duration leads to a tremendous number of sort of unforced errors, right? Organizations that aren't sleeping, the IT team is stressed out, they tend to make errors if it's not sort of a drilled response. Routing errors, all type of things take place there. And then show of hands, anybody watching Mr. Robot, show on USA? All right, I don't know if it's the best show, but I watch it. So, true to life, one of the things we saw there, and I won't ruin the whole plot, but on the first episode, there's a DDoS attack, and I guess the hero over here in the upper left is a security engineer. So he kind of engages, and of course he's omnipotent. And there's a DDoS attack, and his boss is, tell him to call in a provider, and he was like, well, this is a DDoS attack, but they're masking something else, right? I won't run the whole attack, and that's not far-fetched. We do see that, particularly in financial services. If a bank is getting DDoSed, it's almost always a smokescreen or a delay tactic to buy time for them to execute fraud, right? If somebody can't get to their bank balance, they can't report a fraudulent transfer that's occurring. So very, very common there. It's very difficult for us to get somebody to provide a named case study, but our friends at the Olympics do that every 2 years. They tear everything down, so they're pretty willing to allow us to share their case study. But this is pretty typical what we see, right? So the traffic is not, they do about 3.5 terabits a second, across our platform. We protect against that. I think even before that was sort of one of the original sources of targets of terrorism, right? The Olympics. If you have a message you want to get out, the Olympics tend to be a good source to do that because the whole world's watching. So they see tremendous number of attacks, from people trying to use their website to project their message, whatever that propaganda message may be. But they always get DDoS attacks as well. So the last games were in Russia, and they got 4 out of the 5 lights lit over in Russia, if you guys recall. And that corresponded to the top attacks. So the attacks peaked during sort of the peak events of the games as well, right? So during US-Canada hockey, and then also during the open ceremonies. So in kind of the nation state area, this one was interesting. This one was early last year, a big 200 gigabit a second attack. What's notable here is with a media organization that was attacked over in Eastern Europe, directly correlated to some of the unrest that takes place over there, right? So, it's very well known that at this point nations, including Russia, employ people whose job is to sort of craft the message online. They're on social networks, they're in chat rooms. Somebody decided to take off or remove from the air a nation's primary television media outlet. So we were able to keep them up and keep them running, but that sort of gets into some of that nationalist viewpoint. People want to control that message. DDoS is a great way to silence somebody else's voice. So we certainly see that. So this goes back a little bit, but I think it was very, very interesting. This was the attacks. We're not in the business of attribution, but the US government claims it was the Iranian government behind this. But I can tell you for probably 2 years, almost every day, the very largest Western financial services organizations were under very, very powerful attacks, right? And if you think about it, these are probably the most well-resourced security teams. They pay very, very well if you're a bank. All of them have a regulatory mandate to have DDoS mitigation, but yet they were frequently compromised. They went down during those DDoS attacks very, very regularly. So this gives you a sense, this is us kind of defending one of the banks, but some of the techniques that we saw there and sort of a difference between an amateur attacker and somebody who's a professional, we would see recon, quite a bit from this attacker. They weren't just launching an attack. They would plan it out. They would understand what the defenses were. There was probing. The attacks themselves were all launched from cloud hosting providers. They would change their IPs very, very frequently, so there's some known weaknesses in some of the hardware that ISPs use, and this attacker understood that. It takes a while for some of those hardware boxes to see an attack and then block that IP. This attacker would reverse engineer that, and they, kind of like a boxer, they would punch and move. By the time the devices were detecting that IP was bad and starting to block it, they'd already moved on to another one, right? So they were faster than the defense. Very, very frequent use of the layer 7 attacks, HTTPS encrypted attack, which again gets to that counterplay of DDoS versus confidentiality and integrity. The more security that you do, the more inspection, the more vulnerable you are to DDoS, right? So another technique we saw, and then as those attacks evolved, the attacker had a whole software development lifecycle, so they were evolving these attacks, making them harder and harder to defend as we went. We're over? Okay. All right. So I'm getting a note that we're out of time. I think we got off to a little bit of a late start. So we're wrapped? Is that right? Okay. So I think what we wanted to talk about, a little bit was, there's a couple ways to go about this. If you wanted to defend against this, you can try to defend with a box, right? The challenge you have in the data center is, number one, you're fighting a losing scale game, right? Your attacker has access to cloud level scale. If you cannot match that, just at the start, you're going to have a lot of trouble, right? The other piece is expertise, right? If you're fighting an attack once a year, you're not following these trends all that carefully. So you really need to kind of follow research reports like we publish to understand what those attack techniques are. We talked about some of the attacks there at layer 7. So if you have sort of a transit network, your upstream ISP, they can block to a certain extent. But really, as these attacks get more distributed, one of the weak points of the internet, which is well known, are the peering links between the ISPs. That's very fragile. We see those break during attack. So the architecture that we advocate is stop the attack very, very far from the attacker. Break the attacks up into smaller chunks so they're manageable, and do that very close to the attacker. In our case, we're on about 2,000 ISPs, but the key is to be on the other side of that peering link. And additionally, you need to be able to inspect HTTPS level traffic to spot some of those application layer attacks. Otherwise, you're essentially going to be vulnerable to those layer 7 attacks. So you need data, you need an architecture that's going to be sufficient in terms of scale, availability, resilience. You need a plan, and you need people with expertise. And in terms of that plan, I'll quote a great American philosopher and poet, Mike Tyson, who said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. So I would say that you really want to make sure that you're vetting that plan and you drill that plan. When we see these attacks where people get these extortion campaigns and they have 24 hours, that is very, very painful for a lot of organizations. You don't want to be thinking, you want to be executing, right? So if you get hit, it's got to be sort of like a military operation. We've done this, we've practiced it, we're going to go through our checklist. You don't want to be architecting on the fly. Humans don't function well in that environment. You get configuration errors, all type of problems. So with that, I apologize about the environmentals, and thank you for your time.